Welcome to Hampden-Hampshire and Franklin Conservation District's joint winter workshop series on native plants. Tonight's talk is titled Designing with Native Plants by Heidi Dollard. Heidi is a co-chair of the steering committee of the Massachusetts Pollinator Network. She works to educate gardeners and homeowners on how they can support pollinators and other beneficial wildlife while creating a beautiful and low-maintenance landscape. Heidi has a master's of science in biology and is a master gardener. She has been an enthusiastic native plant gardener for many years. Heidi was interviewed twice by local news outlets, and her garden was featured on the Fine Gardening blog. Welcome, Heidi.
Thank you. And welcome, everybody. This is a perfect evening to be looking at beautiful plants, green in the summer. So let's get started. But before we do, I have a little bit of a disclaimer. I wrote my description before I actually did the presentation, and there's no way I could fit everything in. So this is really about designing with native plants. I'm not talking about obtaining native plants or really any specific ones, but some of that information will be available in a resource sheet, which Megan will send out to everybody. So let's first start with why native plants. That is the key question. That's why we're all here. The reason is that the Earth is experiencing a biodiversity crisis. And this is not, I'm not overstating this. This really is, we're really in desperate straits. We're losing species. There's a massive insect decline, which of course, insects feed everything else. And we see that because we also see vanishing birds, that birds are declining both in species and in numbers of individuals. So more than 1 in 4 birds has disappeared in the last 50 years. That's well within my lifetime. So we have to do something. Again, native plants are the foundation of the food web, and we see that in these two slides. The one on the left is a picture of a milkweed caterpillar feeding on a milkweed plant. This is an iconic combination. Everybody's heard about it. But the reason this is a good illustration is because those caterpillars, those monarch caterpillars, only eat plants in the milkweed genus. They need, those are the native plants. Those are an example of the native plants that are becoming scarce in our landscape. And that's why we're losing caterpillars. And then the picture on the right shows how caterpillars are the basis of the bottom of the food chain. We see a white-eyed vireo feeding her, I think it's probably the mother, feeding her chicks, a big fat caterpillar. Those, a pair of Carolina chickadees need 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars just to feed a clutch of chicks until they're ready to leave the nest. And then she keeps feeding them. So she probably needs way more, like 10,000, 12,000. So you can see that our landscape needs hundreds of thousands of caterpillars just in a small area, just to support the songbirds we all like to see in our backyard. So let's start talking about what we can do. And the whole idea is we need to get native plants into our human-managed landscapes. But first, what is a native plant? That means a plant that grew in this area before Europeans arrived on the continent. That we know that date. It's a straight species. It's not a cultivar. A cultivar or a nativar. You may have heard that phrase, nativar. That's some kind of human-created variation on a straight species. A straight species is a wild-type plant that you would find growing out in a field or in the woods. A nativar is one that has been bred by humans to be better. Better means better for humans, not for the wildlife. Sometimes these cultivars and nativars are as good as the wild type, but most of the time they're not. The preliminary studies show that about 20% of the time they're as good or even better sometimes than the wild type, but 80% of the time they are not as good. They are worse. And the two characteristics in particular that are especially make them especially not useful is when their foliage is a different color. So you'll see a lot of, especially bushes that are bred to have purple foliage, which, you know, is cool to see in the garden, but it oftentimes makes it either inedible for caterpillars, or they can't even recognize that it's food. So different colored foliage is bad for feeding native caterpillars. The other characteristic is double flowers, and that's one that you see quite a bit. If you've seen echinacea, hydrangeas, all kinds of flowers, they're bred to be poofier and cooler looking. Of course, that's good for humans, but not good for native insects. So I recommend, you know, if you want one of those crazy echinacea that are like orange or something, you can plant it, but just make sure that at least 70% of the plants that you do purchase and you do put into your landscape are native straight species, wild type. So when we talk about here, what does here mean? To some people, it means like right here beneath our feet. In a very narrow a narrow area called an ecozone. At the Massachusetts Pollinator Network, which is what I work with, we have a broader definition, or many of us have a broader definition, at least for horticultural purposes. So we say that a native plant is something that was here on this continent, east of the Mississippi, north of Florida. And that includes an awful lot of plants. And the reason we feel this way is that we believe that the plants from that area are useful to native insects. So the question is how to make your yard into habitat. First of all, reduce lawn. I have a whole talk about how utterly useless lawn is, or pretty useless ecologically. And then I mentioned the majority of the plants in your landscape should be, to support those reproducing birds, for example, should be the straight species, the wild type, not cultivars. So this is what I mean by 70% native plants is actually the biomass. So if you could cut off all of the leaves and edible stems and weigh it, it would mean 70% by weight. So that's pretty hard to actually accomplish, but you can kind of estimate it. And one thing that will give you an awful lot of biomass is trees and shrubs. So planting in layers, a tree layer, a shrub layer, maybe a layer of flowering plants and grasses we call forbs, can provide the most biomass and also the most varied number of ecological niches, which is going to give you the greatest biodiversity. So you need ideally flowers that are blooming from early spring through frost, because a lot of bees and other insects some species start out really early. Some species don't actually appear until late. You need to be able to feed the full complement of insects that may want to live in your yard and visit your yard. You need a variety of flower shapes and colors. Include host plants. Host plants are plants that feed early life stages. So that milkweed is a host plant to the monarch caterpillar. The the butterfly lays its eggs on that plant, and when they hatch, the caterpillars can eat those leaves and also provide a place for it to live. So that's what we mean by a host plant. Without host plants that feed the early life stages, you don't get any adults. Seems kind of obvious when I say it, but traditionally a lot of butterfly gardens just included plants that would attract butterflies because people want to see butterflies. Traditionally, people have not wanted to see caterpillars, but if you don't have caterpillars, you don't get butterflies. Something I'll talk about briefly, but is really important, is all the dead stuff on your yard is really important habitat. It feeds the soil. Many, many, many beneficial and essential insects live in that dead stuff. They live in dead logs, in trees, standing trees, trees that have fallen. The leaves are very, very important, and that's where many, many caterpillars and other essential insects spend the winter. So again, if they can't survive the winter, they're not going to be there in the spring. And again, of course, you want to avoid chemicals. So let's talk about reducing your lawn. A lawn with non-native foundation bushes, as you see in this picture, they are the most common plants in the human designed landscape in all of the United States and Canada. I've heard people say in North America, but I'm not sure that's true in Mexico, but it's definitely true in this country and Canada. This is this is an area the size of Pennsylvania. And yet this stuff that we maintain in our yards has very little ecological benefit and is depriving native insects and birds and the rest of the wildlife that we need from food and a place to live. So again, 70% straight species. Doug Talamy and his graduate student, Desiree Narango, did some studies which showed that in a suburban landscape, if 70% of the biomass were native plants, then the species they were looking at was the Carolina chickadees. They found they could build a nest, they could raise chicks, the chicks could live. If there wasn't that 70%, either the parents didn't bother to build a nest or they did and the chicks died. They didn't make it they didn't fledge. And as I mentioned, cultivars are sometimes as valuable as straight species, but most of the time, less useful or not at all. And I can speak in more detail about that. If people have questions, let me know in the chat. So non-native plants provide a lot of nectar and pollen. Butterflies will get nectar from any plant. They're very generalist. They don't need native species to find nectar, but bees do. Bees are often much more specialized. Yes, they can drink nectar and often collect pollen, but some of them are very specialized and they need a very specific plant. And as I said, the caterpillars are often very focused on a particular species or genus or a very narrow range of genuses. So again, you got to have those babies if you want any adults. So here I want to expand more on planting in layers. If you combine the trees, bushes, and ground level plantings, you will get maximum biomass and maximum biodiversity. And that's really what we want. By biodiversity, we mean as many species as possible of everything, of all the insects, all the plants that could possibly live there. I mean, of course, you can't be perfect. I'm kind of talking about the ideal, but every little thing you can do is really beneficial. Here's an example of blooms from early spring through frost. On the left, we have willows, and willows are super early blooming. You know, you see those pussy willows out, you know, really early, sometimes like even February or March. And then as you'll notice, as the pussy willow matures, it gets kind of fluffy and the end gets kind of powdery and yellow. That powdery yellow stuff is pollen. And those early flying bees really, really need that. Most of the early flowers in our landscape are from flowering trees. And that includes things like maples and oaks, which actually are not pollinated by bees. They're wind pollinated, but the bees still eat the pollen. So that's another reason why it's important to get some trees into your landscape. They provide the food in the early spring. And then the middle picture is another kind, this orange flower is another type of milkweed. Its common name is actually butterfly weed. And you can see why it's very popular with butterflies, but it also feeds those monarch caterpillars. And then on the far right is our common New England aster. It's a beautiful plant. Everybody loves it. But there's many, many species of asters beyond the New England aster, probably 20 or 30 species that are native to our area. And they are very late blooming, and they're an excellent source of pollen and nectar for late flying insects. And you can see there's a little tiny caterpillar on that purple flower. Here is an example of a variety of shapes and colors. Different bee species have adapted to feed on specific flower types. So some bees have really long tongues, and they are specialized to flowers with a very kind of trumpet shaped with a long throat. A variety of these different types will supply pollen and nectar to the widest range of bee species. And so, as I mentioned, some bees are generalists, but some are very specialized, and it's the specialized bees that tend to be at risk of extinction. Here, I want to go into more detail about retaining dead plant material. I know this can be hard on a small lot, but even on a small lot, you might be able to find an unused corner, an out-of-the-way place where you can just stash some dead stuff and let it rot, because that is really, really important to ecology. There is a piece of rotting log on the ground is like an ecosystem unto itself. But first of all, leaving the leaves under the trees where those leaves fell is just essential for allowing many, many essential insects, including most caterpillars, to complete their life cycle through the winter and then wake up and reproduce and produce more generations. Some caterpillars just cling to the leaves. They fall down when the leaf dies and falls to the ground, and they just stay attached to that leaf. Some of them detach from the leaf and burrow into the soil underneath the leaves, and that's why the leaves are also important, because they provide soft soil underneath those leaves, which is really essential to a lot of insects. A lot of bees are ground nesting bees, and they burrow into the ground and have nests in those burrows. And so they need soft soil also. And a lot of them lay eggs in those burrows, and that's how the generations survive the winter. The ones that don't burrow into the ground live in dead stalks, and that is illustrated in the middle picture. Those stalks might be a little too thin. They need to be at least 1/8 of an inch in diameter, the hollow core, sometimes a pithy core. So that's important too. Just leave them standing. And those dead flower heads, they feed the birds, they look cool in the snow, and they're now kind of like a fashion statement among garden designers, which I will show you in a minute. The last thing on this slide I want to discuss is the importance of leaving standing dead wood. I mentioned the importance of fallen logs. If you can, leave just the trunk. It's called a snag. I mean, you could leave the whole thing if it's out of the way. So many people are really worried about a dead tree falling on them or their car or their house. And yes, it's mostly branches that are the cause of trouble. Um, uh, Branches die and fall off. But the snag, the trunk, is where many, many, many beetles live, and many birds need to burrow into that standing snag. 85 species of our local birds nest in dead trees. So no dead trees, you won't have, those birds can't find a place to build a nest, they can't reproduce. This picture that I'm showing you is from a very fancy garden in Britain that I visited a couple of years ago. And this gardener, he was actually doing a presentation to our group. He explained that due to climate change, they've had a lot of trees die in their garden. In fact, he was kind of, alarmed about it. But he had made this decision to leave this grove of trees as standing deadwood because he really thought that they were very dramatic and sculptural. And that's a trend we're seeing in a lot of upscale gardens by top designers as well. So if you want to get rid of your lawn, there's many, many choices, and you have to kind of go with what your taste is and what works for you. Of course, there's gardens, there's meadows. A lot of people automatically think of a meadow. It's not always what I would recommend, and we can talk about that more later if you want to discuss it. Ground covers are an excellent choice. There's many super, super native ground covers, and they have a lot of benefits and a lot both to the homeowner and also to the wildlife. Trees and bushes, I mentioned the tremendous ecological benefit that they have. Instead of like a couple of trees, you could plant like a little copse of trees. That means a group of trees, all of the same species. And there are trees that are naturally will spread via suckers. So it isn't that hard to get a whole copse of them. It isn't that expensive if you just let them go and do their thing. And then there's a design that I call that actually I don't. Some of the ecological designers are calling soft landing, and I'll talk about that later. So here I'm going to talk about specific design guidelines on the large scale. It's very hard to completely get away from grass. If you can, that's great. But most people need at least some grass because there's no native plant that is as tough and can take as much foot traffic as are lawn grasses. And remember, lawn grasses are not native. Not a single one is native. They're all from Europe. They're all derived from pasture grasses. They have been cultivated, to the umpteenth degree. There's probably tens of thousands of different cultivars that have been created to be incredibly tough, incredibly beautiful. Some of them require a ton of chemicals. Some of them require a lot of mowing. That's not an accident. This is what the turf industry wants you to be doing. But it is hard to say, okay, I'm not going to have any grass. You may need some grass for paths if you have dogs, if you have kids. They are a good choice for paths. And I really emphasize the importance of having paths through your landscape. So it's a very inexpensive way to provide a very human-friendly navigation system through what otherwise might be perceived as not a friendly landscape to humans. Another super important feature to provide a sense of welcome and familiarity to your neighbors and your friends, and also just plain old aesthetics, is sharp edges, borders, mown paths, hardscape, shrubs that have a very definite shape. This big tree here is not shaped, that's its natural shape, but the edges provide a very sharp, distinctive edge, which really contrasts with all this kind of loose and wild ground cover, all these grasses. So that can be really important. Another feature is that you have a very manicured and controlled garden landscape close to your house, close to your walkways, maybe your driveway. And then as you get farther away, it gets progressively wilder and more native. So I recommend, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. And again, providing space for allowing dead plants to stay on your property. It's really important. Another reason why it's really important to retain those dead plants is if you send them off to the landfill, they rot in very big piles and they produce a lot of methane. If they rot in little piles where they can get a lot of oxygen, they produce very little methane. And methane is a terrible greenhouse gas, much worse than CO2. So anything you can do not to send dead plant material to the landfill is a benefit for the environment. Here are two pictures of, I think, lovely front yards. These are real life front yards. Not all the pictures I'm going to be showing you. Some of them are by famous big deal designers. This is the one on the left is the yard that is next door to my daughter who lives in Asheville, North Carolina. And her neighbor, I think, has done a lovely job of using grass just for a walkway through her front yard, this little meandering walkway. The house is farther to the left. The street is over here. And you know, she has trees, she has bushes, she has a ground, I will, you know, not a low ground cover, but you know, a forb layer. She has some grasses, flowers. It's I think that it's really a lovely front yard landscape. And in Asheville, South Carolina, it's not unusual. It's very, very socially acceptable. And then this one is one of my friends who has a very wild meadow, and this meadow goes off to the left all the way to the street. But she's kept a mown area next to her house because she likes to sit outside at her table. Sometimes she has a table and have tea with her friends. And that's really all the grass she needs. And that's her front yard. And people love her meadow. When they see her out working, they love to stop and chat with her about her meadow. Again, I really, really think paths are essential if you're going to have anything other than a grass-dominated landscape. They're very important psychologically, both even if people aren't going to walk on them, they draw the eye into the landscape. So they're important for lines of sight and also for physical access, not necessarily for visitors, but for you so that you can know what's going on in your yard. You may not be able to see as much as you could when it was just a big flat lawn. So you want to be able to just, you know, take a tour of the periphery of everything going on and keep an eye on it. And you'll feel pretty comfortable doing that if you have a mown path, for example. You may not want to walk through the meadow. You may worry about ticks. It may be wet, and those are real considerations. You shouldn't walk through a meadow unless you are dressed to prevent getting ticks. So again, have paths all through your landscape so that you can get to every part of your yard, no matter what the planting is. And mown paths are very easy and inexpensive. And if they're meant for people other than just for utility, other than just for you to be walking around, if they're meant for people, for guests, for your family, they should be ideally 4 to 6 feet wide so that people can walk side by side and not brush against the plants. This is something I just was made aware of in the past couple of years. Now that I'm doing all this garden consulting and giving talks, I'm talking to people about their landscapes all the time. A lot of people do not want to touch plants. They don't want to be in a situation where they have to touch a plant. I think they're worried about stinging nettles, which doesn't happen very often. But ticks, they could be wet. They could have, burrs on them. Psychologically, they don't want to do it. So make the environment psychologically safe for them by having wider paths rather than narrower ones. And it's especially important if you're going to have something like a meadow in your front yard, mow an edge around that meadow, an edge between the sidewalk and your meadow so that passersby do not have to brush against those plants. This will make your landscape much more acceptable to the neighbors. Two more examples of sharp edges on the left-hand side. This is a photograph from Great Dixter, one of the most famous gardens in the world. And I have to say, it deserves its reputation. It is a phenomenal garden. But this illustrates the importance of sharp edges. So not only is there's this sharp mown edge, whoops, I didn't mean to do that. There's a sharp edges of this paved path, but also notice the sharp edges of this clipped hedge. Now, I am not endorsing clipped hedges. Believe me, that's a ton of work. But again, if you buy some bushes that have a naturally very defined shape, not feathery, but very closely, very dense foliage with like a geometric shape, like a cone, you can achieve the same objective without clipping a hedge. And over on the right is it's a flowering grass. I guess they call it a flowering lawn. This is a Chanticleer garden, one of my favorite gardens. I think it's one of the most exciting gardens in the United States. It's very artistic and very inventive. I love going there. And you can see, in order as contrast to sort of contain this wild flowering meadow, they've lined it with a very, very prim and proper strip of lawn, and then an edge, a hardscaped edge, and then a hardscaped walkway. And you can see how it makes this crazy wild space look like it's under control, folks. Do not be alarmed. People are here to take care of you. And psychologically, that's what you want to convey, especially if you live in, a suburban neighborhood, or if you live in town. People don't want a bunch of wildness impinging on them, and you need to respect that. So here's an example of civilized near the house, wilder as you move away. I did not mention, I'm going to go back to this picture. this is my yard. So I am fortunate in that I have a view, but the majority of um, my yard, this is over my leach field, where I can't plant any trees or bushes. This is a little blue stem meadow. This is pretty late in the year. I think this is October. You can see I still have stuff flowering. See, all through there. And this is sort of the distant view. It's pretty wild. And this is what the front dooryard looks like. So you can see it's civilized. This is the front door here. I have hardscape. This is a pebble patio. This is a, Goshen stone, a little more pebble. A pot. Pots are very good at conveying um, a human lives here. Don't worry, folks. Everything's under control. This is a native plant, one of my favorites. It's called Pearly Everlasting, host to a lot of butterflies. And you can't really see that here are two different kinds of annuals. This is flowering tobacco. This is my favorite zinnia. In here is a non-native sedum, autumn joy. And then back here are a couple of more, I think that's Veronicastrum, and we have some agastache that have gone by, and they're dead flower heads. So you can see I think this is a lovely, partly native vignette. I am kind of breaking my rule here a little bit by letting these plants flop into the walkway, but this is not the public walkway. And along here, from the driveway to the front door, there's no floppy plants. So I am kind of following my rule. But then you see when you go farther beyond is that wild meadow and all those trees. So that's an example. Here, I'm going to go into more detail about retaining dead plant material. The ideal is you can just stash it out of sight, but not everybody has that luxury. And leaving the leaves where they fall whenever possible. You may not be able to do it on every square inch. And if you have a lawn, you can't do it on the lawn. Lawns do not like leaves left on them for any period of time, and certainly not over the winter. So you have to do something with the leaves on the lawn. But if you create a lot of garden space of some kind, then the leaves can stay there. Yes, even oak leaves. Oak leaves are a little bit more problematic. They don't break down, which actually is kind of an advantage too. It makes a lovely natural mulch. And oaks are the top plant for hosting caterpillars. Some of them host over 500 different species of caterpillars. So if you've got oaks, they are just like an ecological powerhouse. And there's bazillions of caterpillars living in those leaves. So it really is important to let at least some of those dead oak leaves just stay where they are. And if you can plant stuff under the oak tree that can pop up through the oak leaves, that's kind of an ideal situation for everybody. But if you can't find a place to just stash the dead stuff, there's ways of actually using it. In this case, these are some willow branches that I cut down, and I'm using them to make a rustic garden edging. This is a pile of brush. It's in a fancy garden. I think this might be, not sure. It might be in Chanticleer, but this has become very fashionable, is arranging all your dead stuff in kind of a somewhat neat looking pile. And then over here on the right is, I took this picture in a garden tour in Newburyport, Massachusetts. And Newburyport is a very, very upscale neighborhood. And this is a really upscale house, as you can see. But they deliberately left a snag, a dead tree. I'm sure they had the money to cut it down if they wanted, but they felt that it was an interesting and sculptural piece of the landscape, and it looks cool. So I want to address some of the things that people complain about when they complain about native plants. They can look wild and messy. They can look weedy or rangy or sloppy. They're often vase shaped. They're not mound shaped, which is what a lot of people want in their yard. A lot of times they have bare legs. Sometimes the lower leaves die. They get floppy. And the reason they get floppy is that most native plants, especially meadow plants, as you see here, which are often moved into gardens, are accustomed to very poor soils, or what we say lean soils. But what we've been taught as gardeners is you want to really, really enrich your soil with a lot of compost and fertilizer. And that creates the plants that are not bred to take advantage of all that. It makes them have this very leggy, weak growth. They grow fast, and then they flop. A lot of them are prone to self-seeding and spreading, which could be a good thing if you have a garden that can accommodate that. A lot of the flowers are not nearly as showy as what you're going to see if you go to like Andrew's Garden Center. They're subtle. Um, they're not, they don't look like a geranium that you might have on your windowsill. And the color palette is limited. So again, here on the upper left, we have a garden of well-behaved cultivars. See, they make cute little mounds. They don't have bare legs. And what a pretty little garden that makes. Now over here we have the New England aster that does have lovely flowers, but the rest of the plant, it's this person posted on Reddit because she thought her plant was sick. No, this is the normal state of a New England aster. It's got bare legs, it's rangy. She's planting it like it's a specimen plant. That is not a good gardening design decision. So the other thing is the limited palette. Back in the day, before I really understood the importance of native plants, I like to have a color scheme in my garden, and many of us do. I have a lot of friends that think yellow is just a detestable color. Um, Somebody told me it was like a low class color. It is very common. One reason why it's so common in wild type plants is bees and other pollinators love yellow. I don't know why, but they are very tuned in toward yellow. And there's all kinds of interesting studies of what these flowers look like to a bee, or they look like to another insect that's coming in to pollinate. So my advice is just go with what's blooming at a particular time. I find if I meet the other requirements that I listed, having things blooming early through frost, different flower shapes, something blooming all the time, you just can't be that picky about color. And I also find that it all looks really good together, turns out. And even there were some colors of yellow that I was pretty unhappy with. But I found that if I used them farther away from the house where if there was a huge patch of them, they actually looked really good. And if I mixed them with blue or purple, they really, really made the blue and purple pop. So, again, I think you have to kind of work with the characteristics of the native plants, and that includes not being a yellow hater. So on a garden scale, a smaller scale, here are some guidelines that address some of the issues that I discussed about what native plants are like. So first of all, plant in big sweeps. Interplant with grasses, minimal space between the plants. Use non-natives as accents. In this picture, this gardener these are big sweeps of mountain mint here. And then she has these are just annual zinnias. She has a nice butterfly. Again, so use non-natives to fill gaps in the blooming scheme as accent color, use them more close to the house, and use dead plant material as features. So those dead flower heads actually look kind of cool. So here's another example of planting in big sweeps. One reason why it's really good to do is that it helps foraging bees. When bees go out shopping, looking for food, they hone in on one particular flower, and they just want to go to all those flowers in the neighborhood before they move on to another flower type. So if they hone in on a Rudbeckia, on a black-eyed Susan, they want to just fill up as much as possible on that black-eyed Susan before they move over to the Echinacea. So the more densely you can plant one food type, you save the bees a lot of work. They don't have to fly 100 yards to the next clump. It's right there next to them. This really helps them metabolically. It's really a good thing to do. Now, for people, visually, if you have a flower that's kind of subtle, if you plant a big clump of it, it makes it magnificent. It really magnifies whatever subtleties that it has. Also hides those nasty looking bare legs, and it makes the landscape look more intentional. The bigger and more blocks you have, the more it conveys to an observer. This was a planted landscape as opposed to, a random meadow, which has its charms too. But, a lot of times you want to convey to the world, this is a garden. This isn't an accident. Interplanting with grasses, another way to hide bare legs, provides nice contrasting foliage textures. It can provide visual interest between bloom periods, and they look really good when they're dead. And Pete Udolph, who I'm going to talk about later, has said that one of his main criteria in choosing plants for a new landscape design is how good they look when they're dead, both, the whole plant and the flower head. So these the grasses, their seed heads provide feed for birds, and also the plants themselves are host plants to a number of caterpillars. One caveat is that I did not know the importance of this when I planted my little blue stem meadow, is it's important to plant, if you're going to have predominantly grasses, you need both warm season grasses. My little blue stem is a warm season grass, so it doesn't really get going till June. But I needed to plant some cool season grasses that start greening up early when the weather is still cool, like in the early spring. So that's just a little lesson learned that I learned too late. Well, I'm still working on it. So plant plants close together. Another way to hide those bare legs, floppy plants leaning each other. It's what, if you plant enough plants, you don't need any mulch. And mulch is an important tool when you're first getting a garden going, but you don't want to be mulching after a couple of years. The plants should provide their own mulch. And some of that mulch-free ground can give access to soft soil for those ground nesting bees and other insects that need to burrow. Here's an example of using non-natives as accents. In this landscape on the right, these are all various, I don't know, black-eyed Susans. I don't know the specific species, but those are probably all natives. And then this person interplanted with this pink cosmos, which does it. I think a yellow sweep of flowers really does look nice when it has a contrasting color. And then over here, this is a clump over here on the left. This is a clump of native Monarda bee balm. And then there's this is a non-native allium. And I think these are annual verbena. So that provides a nice, and they'll keep going the whole season. So, that's a nice thing to do. Here's an example of using dead flower heads as part of the design. This is a Pete Udolph photograph. The dead stalks, as I mentioned, are nesting sites for many bees. They provide winter interest, they feed birds. They actually provide visual interest during the growing season. Just leave those dead plants, saves time and effort, no need for a fall cleanup. As dead plants rot in place, they feed the soil and, as I mentioned, many critters. And that dead wood is just really essential for many, many, many things. So do we need to rethink our vision of what a beautiful landscape is? Well, yes and no. If this is your idea of the perfect landscape, you can't do that with native plants. This is a traditional Victorian annual garden. This is completely impossible with native plants. But many traditional garden styles going back, hundreds of years are very, very doable with a 100% native landscape, or at the very least with a 70% native landscape. So you can do this. This is a picture I took of a fairly traditional perennial border at a garden called the Weathersfield Estate, and it's in upstate New York. The rest of the garden is extremely formal, lots of clipped hedges. But they had this perennial border and pretty much everything except that marigold. I think maybe, I'm not sure what this is. That may not be native, but everything else here is native. And that makes a pretty nice border. Uh, Again, this person, well, this is a cultivar, but of phlox, but that's okay. This is apparently bees like pretty much every kind of cultivar of phlox and butterflies, but they couldn't be too picky about the colors, but it worked out fine. So this picture is from Sissinghurst in Britain, another one of these world famous gardens. And this is the White Garden, which represents, which is an example of kind of a upscale cottage garden. Cottage gardens were, at least traditionally or nominally, gardens that were grown by peasants, poor people in Britain, and they took home cuttings and planted from seeds. And it was just this hodgepodge, food plants were mixed in, cabbages, whatever. And it got to be fashionable. A couple of garden designers, William Robinson was one, the one that we all remember is Gertrude Jekyll developed it into the what we now think of as the perennial border, and that's what we see here. And this kind of lush, huge blooming mass of flowers without any really strict organization and without any space between the plants is something native plants can do really, really well. And now I'm going to show you some other examples. This is Ohm and von Sweden. Unfortunately, they're both no longer with us. But in the 1980s and 1990s, they developed this, what they called this, well, a lot of people called the New American Garden. And two of the features which are important to us is one, they minimized grass, lawn, but they used a lot of grasses as part of the design. And you can see in this particular one, these clumps of grasses, not all native, um, are really the backbone of this landscape. So when I talk about Oman van Sweden and some of the other modern designers, one of the ironies is that they were inspired by American prairie plants, and reading about it is really interesting. But and some of them were given specific assignments to do designs just with native plants, like Oman van Sweden did a native plant meadow at the New York Botanical Garden in the Bronx. But they are not ecological restoration gardeners. They don't always use native plants. Although they like them and they often use them, they weren't coming at this from a desire to be ecological. They came at this from a desire to be beautiful, from aesthetics. So the lesson we can take away from this is that these types of plants that they chose for their beauty are our native plants. And so we can use their styles with native plants and achieve the same effect. So the other big name, probably the biggest name right now in garden design, is Pete Udolph. You may have heard of him. He very famously designed the Lurie Garden in Chicago and a couple of gardens in Manhattan. One is the High Line, which is really a fabulous garden. And it does have a lot of native plants, but it's not strictly native plants. He chose the native plants that are there, he chose because he thinks they're beautiful, not because he was under orders to plant native plants or because he wanted to be ecological. In fact, I watched a movie of him, a documentary, and he was actually pretty snotty about saying, hey, I don't care about native plants. I'm just all about the art. So there you go. You can be all about the art and use native plants. But you can see he really, really loves those dead flower heads. And here over on the right is he's showing planting in big clumps and sweeps, less so on this side. But again, lots of grasses. So all the principles that I mentioned are really doable in what these top designers are doing. So this last example, in my opinion, is one that's easiest for people in a suburban landscape or with small yard to achieve. To me, this is the real pollinator garden. And I just learned, just like a week or two ago, from this ecological gardener named Rebecca McCacken. She's one of my heroes. She calls this the soft landing design. And what it consists of is one or more native trees, and then underneath the tree, extending at least to the drip line and possibly beyond, is a garden. And that garden, obviously, it has to meet the growing conditions of growing under the tree. But it's native plants, and it could be something very homogeneous, like we see over here, or it could be something very mixed up with lots of different plants. Hopefully, it meets the some of the requirements or some of the guidelines they mentioned earlier about blooms early to late, a variety. And it can be pretty wild looking, but if it's surrounded by a mown path or a mown grass, it's going to look really nice. So this is just I don't know if any famous designer did it, but this is in, a pretty casual, informal landscape. Over here, this is a an Ohm and von Sweden design, and this is a native birch, native grasses. I don't know what this is over here, but I think it's native. Um, and you can see it could be adapted to a very formal situation too. Again, those sharp edges, really useful visually. So this is the combination that I recommend to most people when people have a big bare yard and they say, I don't know where to start. I say, well, first of all, do you have a native tree in your yard? Okay, make a garden under it where the leaves can just stay where they fall. And then figure out what will grow under that situation, what native plants, and you have this soft landing scenario here. So that would be in summary what I would recommend. So with a bit of ingenuity, knowledge of native plants, you do need to be able to plant the right plant in the right place, an open mind, and a sense of adventure. You can make your landscape welcoming to pollinators and to people. And this is a Larry Weiner design. He's one of my heroes. He does amazing stuff, and he has a great book, which is in my resource document. So I work with the Massachusetts Pollinator Network in addition to the Hampden-Hampshire Conservation District. So I recommend that you go to our website, and if you're not already on the mailing list, do get on the mailing list. And I can now take questions. So I'll stop sharing. Well, maybe I'll just leave that up for a minute. Do you want to see if there's any questions?
Yeah, let's see. I don't see
Oh, I see
new
5.
questions in the chat. There's some conversation there about
Oh,
the screen. But
oh,
I
I
have a
see.
question from something that you were talking
Oh
about.
dear.
Anyone else? Here's a new one. I have a large oak tree in front of my yard. What plants would like to grow under it?
Well, oaks, as I mentioned, are super good because they are, well, native oaks. I don't think we have any non-native oaks that people plant. I think all the oaks that people have are native. Not true of maples, though. There's some nasty non-maples out there in the landscape. So another good thing about oaks is that they have deep roots. So you can plant stuff under them and there won't be a lot of root competition. So if this is very, very shady, a lot depends on how important it is to you to have a very low growing ground cover. The advantage of a low growing ground cover is it more mimics the visual, it reads like lawn, which is important to some people. But if you're willing to go with taller stuff, one of the best things that you can plant under there is asters. There's a lot of asters that would love to grow underneath, that they're very happy in the shade. Not all asters. You got to, do your research. There's tons and tons of great plant lists on the internet. And when Megan sends out my resource document, there'll be some links to some good plant lists there too. So I would start with some asters. There's also some very cool early growing plants like Virginia bluebells, would be really nice. Then some of the ground covers, let's see. One of the ones that I really like for shade, it's very good. It's very low, grows close to the ground. It's called Green and Gold, and it gets a little bright yellow flower that starts really early, like in even in late April, and goes often, it keeps flowering through June. So those are some things to start with. But if you look at some of these plant lists, a lot of them are you can sort or you can filter by bloom time or whether sun or shade. It's probably, I don't know, it, you should probably take a look at the soil. Does it dry out a lot or does it stay kind of moist? If it's a big oak tree, it might need a lot of it might need extra water, at least, well, it will need extra water to get everything started. Oh, and
Okay.
there are more questions.
Yeah. Do dead
Okay.
trees need to be
Do I
native?
mow my meadow? I have not yet mown the meadow, but I will be mowing the meadow. The one of the main reasons to mow a meadow is to prevent it from being taken over by woody stuff like either native stuff, which is, good, like sumac. I do have sumac that encroaches on the meadow, but I've been just cutting it by hand. But then there's a lot of invasive species that will get into a meadow, like bittersweet and multiflora rose. And so you really do need to mow on a regular basis. The experts are now saying that the ideal thing is to mow if you can divide your meadow into kind of three areas and mow a third each every 3 years. Because some of the plants that nest in the flower stalks, I mean, some of the bees that are in the flower stalks actually need more than a year to complete their life cycle in that flower stalk. So it's not good to mow every year, to just make sure that you are not chopping up those bees that haven't yet emerged yet. But a lot of the bees will emerge once the weather gets warm in the spring. So that's the best time to mow. There's actually a lot of conflicting advice, and one of the things is you don't want to mow too late in the spring in case you have ground nesting birds in there. So it's a little bit of I don't know, a considered decision. But if you do the third, a third, a third, and try to mow in the spring after it's been warm for a few days, um, that's probably the safest thing. But
Mhm.
I just mow with a weed whacker. I don't, that's fine. I mean, my property is small enough that I can do that with a weed whacker. Oh, do you remove existing plants and then plant your meadow, or did you selectively remove non-natives? Well, this was a new construction and they brought in incredibly terrible soil to go over leach field, which is normally what they put over a leach field. And I was pretty sure that well, first of all, there were no live plants in it, but I was pretty sure that it had a very minimal seed bank. So I didn't have to do any removal, but I did not enrich the soil. And I planted mostly seeds, but I did plant some plugs, some little blue stem plugs to get that predominantly little blue stem meadow. And I do really love the little blue stem, but I wish that I had planted some cool season grasses in there too. So I didn't remove any existing ones, but if you do a meadow and you don't have new construction, you didn't have a new leach field, you will need to remove existing plants if you want a true native meadow. Something else people do, I do it in another part of my property. Although I've never planted a single grass seed in the backyard, I think it just there was all these grasses already in the seed bank. And so I had a lawn which I just let grow, except that I have paths going through it. And it's not mostly native plants, but I clear out like patches of I pull out or I dig up or I smother, and then I put plugs in or native plants in. So I'm trying to introduce more native plants. So that's another technique you can do. Oh, somebody plans to mow with a sigh, which will also help me see where the invasives. Yes, a sigh is a really good choice. That is a good thing. Yeah.
There's a question a little further up, I think we skipped. Do dead trees need to be native?
No, a lot of bugs will live in non-native trees too, but of- yeah, um, yes,
And
yes,
a dead non-native tree is still a good contributing tree, right?
yeah,
Perhaps in the best way.
yeah.
I was wondering,
That's true.
you mentioned you mentioned the need for cool and warm season grasses, and
Yeah.
you mentioned your love of blue stem. I was wondering if you can recommend some cold season grasses.
Well, I'm experimenting with some right now. I did some winter sowing, and I'll have a link to that in my resource document. So I have a bunch of plugs that some of which I planted in the fall, some of which I'm going to plant out in the spring. There's th this doesn't sound good, but see, I need a cool season grass for a very dry environment because this is over my septic system. It's over the leach field, which is like, you know, practically beach sand. So I looked up on the Prairie Moon site, which has an excellent resource just for looking for plants. And they had two kinds of carex. Carex is the genus of many of our native grasses. And I believe, I'm trying to think of, I think it's called poverty oatgrass, which doesn't really sound that good, but it's supposed to green up quickly, and I'm going to give it a try. If you have a moister environment, I think there's a lot more choices available to you, but I'm not sure what they are off the top of my head because I've been focusing on how to get uh some cool season grasses into my very dry meadow.
Okay.
But check out the Prairie Moon website.
They've
It's
got a
very
great
easy.
search
It's
engine for
yeah,
their
it's really, really
stock.
useful.
Yeah. I know a lot of designers who use that website specifically for that tool.
Yeah.
Let's see. Any other questions? I don't see any in the chat, but if you had some questions that you wanted to ask Heidi live, you're welcome to unmute and turn on your camera if you'd like and talk directly with her.
Well, it's all good. Oh, Jay, do you have a question? Oh, I think you have to unmute yourself.
Yeah, we want to hear you.
I always do that. So, hi, Heidi. Mark
Hi.
and not Jay. In my backyard, before I began putting in native plants, I have in one section a lot of vinca, another a lot of pachysandra.
Mhm.
So I found it that the vinca I can put in plants and they'll do fine. Harder with the pachysandra. That's a struggle to dig up, but I'm thinking that's what I should do. What would you say?
Boy, those are both very tough to get rid of. And well, I have a patch of vinca that invaded well, I think a neighbor planted it when this was still an empty lot, and she was an imperialist gardener and invaded a lot that was not hers. And I think, well, I've heard conflicting things. My vinca is I do occasionally beat it back. If you mow it regularly,
Mm,
I think it will die. And
mm,
that's true of the Pachysandra too. The Pachysandra is tougher.
mm,
If you try to dig it out, I think it's like it will be a lifelong project.
mhm,
So
mhm.
I would recommend mowing it as close as you can to the ground and then smothering it with
Okay.
some really thick cardboard. And the cardboard has to really overlap. There can't be any chinks. And then
Mhm,
putting a really thick layer of wood chips over it. And
okay.
and that cardboard has to extend probably 2 feet beyond the edge of the patch unless it's something you mow regularly. And I think that will do it. I killed, well, this is a long story, but somebody without my permission dumped a whole slew of grass clippings on my property. And I had this enormous pile of grass clippings. And I don't know if you've ever dealt with this, but if it's very wet, it forms this impenetrable mass, and nothing can live under that. It's just it's amazing stuff. So I actually used those grass clippings to kill or to at least
Mm,
set back the edges of my patch of vinca.
mm,
And it did seem to work. And so I think if I had been more serious about it and I'd mowed it and then I'd put cardboard down and then put those grass clippings down, it would have killed the vinca.
okay, good. Thank you. Thank you.
Well,
I don't see any new questions in the chat, but if there are any others who want to do it verbally, that's fine. We'd love to have you pop on. Let's see, new ones or new faces. So thank you, Heidi. This was a really fun conversation. A lot of familiar information, which is really great to have refreshed, and a lot of really fun inspiration for designing in our own landscapes. Lots of thank yous coming into the chat. So I hope you're seeing those.
oh,
And
wonderful.
thanks everyone
Well,
for
thank you all
attending.
for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Take care, everybody.
Good night. Good night, Margaret. Good to see
Yeah.
you.
Thanks, Megan. You too.